Okay, friends, welcome back. I'm looking at the time. We have 30 seconds to go until the program continues. So my name is still Sonja Lindfors, and this is StopHatredNow online. And our first day is called Actions and Accountability. We started the day with a keynote by Michelle Tisdale on the topic Flipping the Script, Changing the Narrative for Anti-Racism and Equality. Then we continued with a panel discussion on clear expectations. And now, dear friends, we will continue with a keynote, Creating Inclusive Diversity, Equity and Inclusion by Gary David, followed by a Q&A, which will be moderated by Jada Berg Söderblom. So, yes, let's continue with the program. Do we have Jada and Gary here?
Hi, Sonja.
Hello. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And now I will give the floor to Gary and Jada. So go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the afternoon session of today's program. I'm Jada Berg Söderblom, one of your moderators for today. I'm an independent arts manager and artistic director of Miklagard Arts and a happy and proud collaborator of the StopHatredNow platform. And description of myself, I'm a white woman with medium short, dark brown curly hair. I'm wearing a black t-shirt and glasses and have a bookcase as my background. And I'm very excited to welcome today's keynote speaker, Gary David, Professor of Sociology from Bentley University, United States. Good morning, Gary.
Good morning, how are you doing?
Fine, thank you. And we are so thankful that you can join us live. I know right now it's 5 a.m. in Massachusetts. Let me introduce our keynote speakers briefly. Gary David has a very interesting background. He's a professor of sociology and experience design at Bentley University. Dr. David also specializes in Arab American identity, theories of immigrant entrepreneurship, and intercultural service encounters research. His work and teaching focus on intercultural, intergroup interactions, developing collaboration and community in workplace. He also is a consultant working with companies on how to create more inclusive diversity and inclusion as part of their strategic planning process. And most interestingly, and relevant to our conversation in today's session, he is one of the architects of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, DEI, bachelor's degree program at the Bentley University. His keynote set the tone for a deep dive into educational opportunities for DEI professional development, a topic that we will open for a discussion later today at the roundtable. Before getting started, a quick reminder for the participants. At the end of the keynote, we will have a short Q&A session. So please prepare your questions and comments. You will have the opportunity to share all with us by using Q&A function of Zoom. So Gary, once again, thank you for joining us and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jada. It's great to be here. And let me start out by apologizing if I start coughing or sneezing. I just was diagnosed with COVID 2 days ago. So not only is it really early in the morning, but also I'm sick. But this topic is too important to take a pass on in terms of the opportunity you gave me. So I really do appreciate the chance to speak with everybody about the idea of what I call inclusive diversity, equity, and inclusion, along with the new major that we created at Bentley University. And I know that Jada described her background. What I am is actually a very interesting question because I'm Arab American, and sometimes institutionally that's treated as being white. Socially, it's not always treated that way. Often it's treated as being other. And so how we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion is very complicated, and it goes beyond definition, and it goes into context of wherever you live. And so that's why I think this topic and the way at least I talk about it fits with the environment that you're in. So while a lot of the examples I talk about today come from the US context, thinking about what DEI, belonging, and social justice means can be adjusted, adapted to whatever context you're finding yourself in. While the principles remain the same in terms of the definitions, how that is enacted is going to be different based on the situational considerations you might have. So with that, let me share my screen. Hopefully folks can see the title screen. I think everyone can. So as Jada said, I am at Bentley University. I'll talk about what that means in a second. And I wanted to start out with some somber news, which is this. Buffalo shooting, 10 dead in racially motivated attack at New York State store. This just happened a few days ago. And this morning I woke up to the news that another shooting took place at a Taiwanese church in Orange County, California. And while the details of that act of violence are still forthcoming, it might seem that it was another racially motivated attack. And as the story says, hate crimes in the US hit a 12-year high in 2020, with over 10,000 people reporting offenses related to their race, gender, sexuality, religion, or disability. Crimes against Asian and Black Americans in particular surged that year, FBI figures suggest. And as police are not mandated to submit hate crime data to the FBI, those numbers are thought likely to be an undercount. And when you look at specific communities, such as the transgender community, the amount of violence that they have had to experience has been dramatically increasing. And that's not an accident. It's not an accident. And I will say, as anybody who watches events in the US knows, and as a sociologist, I have to, that there are prominent voices who are fixated on stoking racial, gender, sexual orientation, resentment. And that resentment creates an environment in which violence is much more likely to take place. And in the United States, there's a thought, a theory, quote unquote, a theory, not an actual theory, but a rationalization for violence called the Great Replacement. And the Great Replacement speaks about how those who are white are being replaced by those who are not. And that the only way forward is by violence, is by fighting back against this encroachment. And when we think about inclusive diversity and inclusion, one of my aims is to let people know, is to create the impression, the perception that diversity, equity, and inclusion is not about giving privilege to some, it's about creating opportunity for all. And it's by bringing together, as we'll talk about, all voices, by bringing together all groups, we are able to succeed much more than if we're separate and especially fighting against one another. In talking about DEI in art and cultural spaces, I wanted to talk about this gentleman a little bit, a man named John Singer Sargent. I don't know if anybody in the audience is familiar with Sargent's work, but he is known as one of the great portrait and figurative artists of his era. He was a student of the world. He was born outside the United States, lived most of his life outside the United States, even though his parents were American. And as a student of the world, really represents in many ways diversity, equity, and inclusion, and in some ways that one might not expect. And that's the piece I want to talk about. Some of his most famous works include portraits, paintings of women. And while he was prolific in landscapes and portraits overall, it's these portraits of women that often draw people's attention. In fact, the middle one with the woman with the black dress, portrait of Madame X, caused quite a stir at the time, in that it was one of the first times in which a woman was, I won't say, it's interesting because while nudes existed of women, the fact that she was in a dress with thin straps, perhaps posed in a quote unquote seductive way, especially for the time, caused such a stir that Sargent had to leave Paris and go to England to continue his work. And so Sargent was about, in some ways, pushing boundaries. And I should say about Madame X, it wasn't a commission that someone sought him to do. He set out to paint the model, to paint the woman, which also showed how Sargent, especially at that time, was playing with societal expectations and norms and pushing the boundaries of those. In fact, there's a book called Sargent's Women, which I actually have right next to me. And the author of the book talks about, with uncanny intuition, Sargent hinted at the mysteries and passions that unfolded in his subjects' lives. These women inhabited a rarefied world of wealth and strict conventions. Yet all of them did something unexpected, something shocking to upend society's rules. And one of the things that people will talk about with Sargent is that he just didn't necessarily draw these women as passive objects to be observed, but as people who had these inner lives. And it's Sargent's ability to delve into their inner worlds through his representation on canvas that drew the author to write about these women and their experiences. And in doing so, Sargent not only produced masterpieces of exquisite quality, but also works that rattled the foundations of established and polite society, which I think we probably all agree that polite society and impolite society needs a good rattling every now and again. But beyond his work on women is something that more recently came to light. And I want to talk a little bit about the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston, Massachusetts, which I have had a chance to visit numerous times. And it's in the Museum of Fine Arts that you'll find the iconic rotunda with murals and reliefs that were created by Sargent. And these murals and reliefs hold a special place logistically and artistically in the museum. When you walk in, it's basically right there, where you can see by staring up or looking at mirrors that allow you to look up the exquisite works of art that Sargent was able to portray. And the figures here primarily are mythic icons rather than real people, where you might have Atlas holding up the world, or Apollo, or other gods and goddesses that Sargent was portraying. But the fact that these were iconic individuals or not real people does not mean that the source of inspiration for these figures, for these images, was not a real person. In fact, the model responsible, and this is where the story gets very interesting and especially relevant for our conversation today, the person responsible is a story perhaps greater than the works of art themselves. Recently, it was a series of sketches on paper were discovered at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, which is located in very close proximity to the MFA. And these sketches on paper were done by Sargent of a man named Thomas McKellar. Now we know it was Thomas McKellar because Sargent actually wrote the model's name on the paper, Thomas McKellar. And it's interesting that even though these were just figurative studies meant to get the artist's eye more accustomed to the model, that Sargent took great care both in signing them, in naming them, but also in preserving them. Because Sargent gave Isabella Stewart Gardner was one of Sargent's great patrons, he gave Gardner these sketches to preserve. And they were put into a file cabinet, into a file case, and more or less forgotten about until a museum curator, in searching through them, came across them. And what we found as a result is Sargent had a secret muse in the figure, literally and figuratively, of Thomas McKellar. And it's interesting because Thomas McKellar was an African-American man. At a time when the color line was strongly enforced in the South, and this is where McKellar was from, and still existed in ways legal and de facto in the North, the artistic and perhaps personal relationship between Sargent and McKellar allowed for these exquisite works of art to be created. And in fact, there was a book and a series, I actually bought the book, called Boston's Apollo, about Thomas McKellar, John Singer Sargent, and the place of race, gender, sexuality, and identity in art. And it's fascinating to think about the fact that despite people viewing the rotunda for all of these years, that the story of McKellar was largely absent. Now, it doesn't mean McKellar was absent, because in fact, there was a painting, there was a painting of McKellar in the Museum of Fine Arts, and it's the painting on the left. At the time, or earlier, the painting was just titled something to the effect of Portrait of Negro Man. and it did not have the name Thomas McKellar associated with it. It's the only work that Sargent produced of McKellar as McKellar. And you can still see it hanging at the MFA today. And when thinking about the life of McKellar, not a whole lot is known. We know that he was born in North Carolina and he experienced Jim Crow discrimination of separate and unequal, of separate drinking fountains, of separate accommodation spaces, of, in many ways, legal servitude. He is believed to be gay and was escaping discrimination not only because of being Black, but also perhaps being gay. He worked as a hotel attendant and elevator operator, and it's here that Sargent met him when Sargent was visiting a hotel where McKellar worked. There's almost no record of his personal life or relations with John Singer Sargent, although it's believed that, or it's at least speculated, that there was a deeper relationship between Sargent and McKellar than just artist and model. And as I said, only one painting of the model as himself has been found or produced. And when we're looking at the overall experience of McKellar, Sargent, and the work produced, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and you can see the virtual exhibit online, created this exhibit, which ran from February 13th to October 12th, 2020. And the materials for the exhibit say the story of McKellar as uncovered by Silver brings to light important issues concerning class, race, and sexuality in American history and art. And I just want to play this one quick clip of his niece on the left and a family friend on the right visiting his grave and letting McKellar know about the exhibit that was taking place.
Well, maybe you know there's an exhibit going on, and I know that family members who have gone on would have wanted somebody to be here to represent the family, and I'm just proud to be that one person to do that.
Now, it's not unusual that a model would be basically not represented in works of art, that the model's job is to be the inspiration and the reference point for the work being created. And so I'm not going to say that Sargent in some way, shape, or form intentionally erased McKellar from history. But the story of McKellar does touch on many important themes of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And these are complicated questions. On the one hand, Sargent was using an African-American man as a model, which at the time might have been considered boundary pushing in many respects. Also, it was likely that McKellar needed the money because as an African-American man living in the North and working as an elevator operator, it's imagined that his funds were not extensive. McKellar was included in the process of creating these great works, but yet his voice and his self was largely erased from them. So while he was included, at the same time, he was excluded. And it also raises questions about justice, about how does the art institution itself come to represent those who are often marginalized in communities, who are often seen as isolated and at risk in the communities in which they reside. That art has a very special place in communicating the voices of those who have a challenge or difficulty communicating their voices themselves because the social forces that exist prevent them from doing so. So there's many complicated questions here, and that's why we created this major on diversity, equity, and inclusion at Bentley University. As the quote says, this might be my quote, I don't know. This is a real discipline, and we're teaching business students who are likely going into this business realm, and they need to have a deep foundation on this. And this is my quote in this news story. A lot of what we're trying to do is talk about people's stories and lived experiences, and those perspectives enrich not just our understanding, but also outcomes. Companies that embrace the DEI strategy do better. It's not just an ethical, moral, philosophical thing or a legal requirement. Companies that take these steps, embrace these approaches, do better. Bentley University is a private business school outside of Boston, Massachusetts, with a heavy emphasis on accounting and finance. And we're ranked nationally and regionally, which is all great. But it's interesting that it was a business university that was the environment in which the first of its kind, the first in the United States, DEI major could be created. And the school has a strong commitment to DE&I, but Bentley also has a very practical orientation to DE&I in all of its programs, that we wanted to teach people the skills they needed to enter in the profession of doing this work, that it's more than just about a sensitivity or an awareness, it's about practical skills and understandings so that these conversations can be facilitated and turned into action. And so companies, organizations, institutions, communities can move forward on what these terms mean to them. And so talking about how to creating inclusive diversity and inclusion, there's a lot to talk about, and I know we don't have a whole lot of time to do so. But I did create 6 steps to think about, and I want to touch on each of them briefly to give people some actionable ideas about how to move forward. And we do have a roundtable workshop coming up later this morning, afternoon. I'm not quite sure what time it will be where you are. But the first thing to do is start with why. Why are we engaging in this effort to begin with? And there's a lot written, and I'm sure people in this audience are familiar with a lot of this work and don't need to be convinced. But one of the points of diversity, equity, inclusion is that it's more than just a checkbox to improve the variety of worldviews in your team. In a diverse world, diversity becomes a requirement, and that we can't design from our bubble. We need to have voice represented from broader stakeholders, constituencies, groups whose perspectives enrich, not just correct our limited views, because we all have limited perspectives. It's just part of being human, but enrich our understanding of the world around us. And we can't design for this beautiful plural world inside the vacuum of our bubble. It requires having diversity in our mindsets in our day-to-day, and having diversity, inclusion, and equity in our action as well. This is a really interesting book called The Customer Comes Second. It's more of a business book, but the author says people from a wide variety of backgrounds build depth into an organization. They offer a source of fresh ideas, new perspectives, and original applications for products, services, and resources. And especially in the art space, this is important because the art space is unbounded by the restrictions that typically accompany a business space. That the art space is about pushing ideas and potentials of what things could be, how things ought to be, rather than business is often about reflecting how things are, or in some respects, how things were. So in art, especially in art and culture, the idea of pushing into where we want to go versus settling for where we are becomes an important element of DEI and J. In terms of defining the terms, I just wanted to put this out there so folks have a general understanding of it and thinking about the differences between these terms. And rather than thinking about them as separate and isolated, they are part of a continuum. And especially around J, with equal rights and equitable opportunities. Looking at the policies, practices, institutional structures, the accountabilities in place to try to create a more just world in which opportunity is equal. And sometimes when you have pushback from people about DEI and J efforts, it's because for the fear of loss of privilege. That equitable opportunity means the loss of privilege and standing because now the playing field is more crowded. But at the same time, having greater input from a variety of voices creates greater opportunity to grow and thrive. And I just wanted to highlight this one idea here that we think in terms of categories that have some cultural and social significance. In Finland, that's going to be different possibly than the United States or any place else in the world. And so you need to think locally. You need to think in terms of what are the relevant categories of cultural and social significance where you live, and for the thing that you're trying to accomplish. And that's integrating persons from diverse backgrounds. Now, again, diversity could be diverse within the organization, from different parts of the organization. It doesn't have to be on demographic categories of race, sex, class, gender, sexual orientation. It could be knowledge-based or professional diversity. And so when thinking about inclusion of diversity, we need to think more expansively than we might just think typically. What are our goals? And I'm not going to go through all these, I don't have the time, but these are reasons companies often adopt a diversity and or inclusion policy. And there's a lot of good reasons. And from my perspective, I'll take any reason as a starting point. Ideally, we want people to move because they see, well, to have a philosophical, moral belief in it, but also practically that companies that do these things do better. But wherever a person or a company starts their journey, that's where I think it's important to meet them. And I really do think it's important to inventory existing successes. Assets-based community development is an approach that was developed in 1993 at Northwestern University. And the focus of ABCD is not on what's missing, what we aren't doing, what's absent, but what are we already doing? What successes can we build on that we already have? In what ways are we already moving towards this goal that we have? Let's identify where our strengths are. Not to say we've already met our goal and we can stop, but to show that whether we knew it or not, we're already on this journey. We're already moving forward. What we're talking about here isn't a new effort. It's just an expansion of likely things that are already going on. And these things might be small. They might seem insignificant, but any starting point is an important point to build momentum and begin that journey to accomplish greater things. And I think it's important to focus on ideas great and small. And so in the art space, there was this project done in Richmond, Virginia, called Monumental Conversations. It was done with a company called Nova Buy. And what they did was, by taking down Confederate statues from the Civil War in the United States, they used augmented reality apps to envision not only what it would look like when those statues were gone, but also to give voice to local community, to give voice to local artists, to represent those voices that were often marginalized. And as this says, Monumental Conversations is a nonprofit community initiative to advance the conversation on the future of Monument Avenue and how we work together to eradicate systemic inequality in Richmond and beyond. The augmented reality tour provides students in public education, along with ongoing project-based digital art, music storytelling, and tech showcase opportunities for students, local artists, musicians, and the community. And so this is a rather significant and tech-savvy movement forward through art to emphasize DEI and J. But then there's also this, pardon me, Figure on Diversity. And this is a group out of Boston, because art should reflect everyone. The artistic practices of figure modeling and life drawing each come with benefits, particularly regarding positive body perception. Models report attitudes which demonstrate their own corporal empowerment, and studies show that these advantages can be reaped secondhand through the practice of drawing a nude model. So for those familiar with figurative work, I don't know what exists in your world, but often models are able-bodied, often of a certain type, typically white, at least in the United States. And the bodies that are represented tend to be cisgendered, often can be cisgendered individuals. And so Figure on Diversity is a small group about pushing the boundaries of what is thought to be representation in art. The project seeks to diversify the field of figurative representation in art education. And finally, inclusive measures that matter. There's been a lot of work that shows how DEI and J increases performance and drives performance. But I would say that you need to develop your own metrics that matter, and it needs to be done from a participatory, inclusive approach. How to bring together the voices that you're seeking to represent and impact to get them to say what would matter to them. There's a really great book called Data Feminism, offers strategies for data scientists seeking to learn how feminism can help them work towards justice, and for feminists who want to focus their efforts on the growing field of data science. But the book is about much more than gender. It's about power, about who has it and who doesn't, and about how those differentials of power can be challenged and changed. So even developing metrics can be an opportunity for DEI and J by incorporating voices that are unrepresented. And so people matter in the metrics that are collected. So I really do appreciate everyone's time this morning. It's been a pleasure, and I appreciate the work that Stop Hatred Now is doing, and I wish everyone a fantastic conference for the rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you for joining us with this very extreme conditions while you are in the middle of COVID. I hope you are feeling better.
Thank you.
Today. And as I said before, of course, we have virtual participants, but if you would like to comment or ask questions, please use Q&A session or function of the Zoom. While you are gathering your thoughts, maybe I can start with one question that I had while I was listening to you. First of all, it's very interesting. Most of the participants I can imagine, and myself and the many organizers of Stop Hatred Now are from the arts and cultural sector of Finland. So of course there is so much discussion currently going on in the arts scene, and many arts and cultural organizations I really try their best efforts to support diversity, equity and inclusion and access in their fields. But on the other hand, to my knowledge, and also I wrote my thesis about that, the primary competences associated with DEI for arts professionals, especially the ones who are in the decision-making structures, remain still not unprioritized. So in that sense, I find very valuable the insight that you bring from the business sector, because there is so much going on, and we should, I believe, so much focus on the business and working structures of our sector itself. So maybe a question to start with. Of course, many universities are also, in order to address the needs of their community, do a lot of efforts, and DEI related efforts are a priority. But offering a bachelor's degree,
Right,
I believe, takes this knowledge to the next level. So to my understanding, you already mentioned why it was needed, connecting to a very interesting case that you presented us. But still, I would like to ask you, how did you and your colleagues, I know you're not the only one, you have other colleagues who prepared the curriculum, design it, and what subjects and courses are included in this program?
thanks for the question. One of the things we did, focusing on the successes and the assets we already have, was we went through and identified courses that already existed, which we could include in the major. And one of the sayings that I really do like to live by is, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. In terms of the classes we have, it might not be the ideal of what we would like to see in a major, but it was an important starting point. And to use design thinking language, we viewed the original inception of the major as a prototype, as a high fidelity prototype, but as a prototype that we could augment and adapt going forward. So we included courses from all over the curriculum. It would be silly to have a major on inclusion and diversity and only have it in one department. So we had courses from management on managing diversity in the workplace. We have courses on race and racism in the United States. We have a law course, or a choice of a law course about, gender in the law or race in the law, outsiders in the law. So we have a foundation, a core of like 5 classes that are from across the university. Then students can go in a Bachelor's of Arts or Arts and Sciences direction and select electives from Arts and Sciences courses, or they can move in a BS or a business degree direction based upon electives in business departments. And so we wanted to create flexibility in the major by allowing students to go in a BA or a BS direction, but also give them a choice in what courses they take. And we only created one new course, and that was an introduction to DEI and J. Everything else was already on the books. And again, ideally, we'd like to see some other courses developed, but we wanted to start and we wanted to make sure we had something in place so that we could build momentum. And it's that process of starting someplace, committing to it, building momentum based on successes that allowed us to get this off the ground in a relatively quick fashion. And that from our initial meeting with me and my two colleagues to it being passed was maybe, I don't know, it might have been 16 months. So it was pretty quick, and that's pretty quick in academic terms, trust me, to get a new major off the ground like this.
Thank you very much. And now we have the first question in the chat. Are you able to see it, or would you like me to read? Or Sonia, maybe you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Thank you so much for a very, very interesting keynote. So many great things. So I just wanted to hear a bit more about strategies to measure and monitor accountability. Gary mentioned metrics as one of the key things to think about, but I feel in Finland or in the Finnish context, like measuring things and statistics when it comes to like diversity are somehow like scared. Also, like we have a legislation problem, so it's harder to like monitor those things. But I was just kind of like wondering what other tools do you really have to enhance or even demand accountability from institutions? So I'm really interested in concrete tools.
Right, thank you. It's a great question. There's a lot to it. I'm just creating a proposal, or I created a proposal to work with a local well-known organization that is looking at extending inclusion and diversity in running, like physical running, in the running community, in running events. And one of the things that they were struggling with too is how do we measure if we're successful? And rather than just giving them metrics, I created for them a framework for beginning the conversation to create those metrics. I would start with diversify your data. Qualitative data is data too. And don't just think in terms of quantitative data. There's this belief that quantitative data is somehow hard data, but as the book Data Feminism, and there's a really another great book called Invisible Women about how women are left out of statistics, how their experiences are not measured. And so looking at what the quantitative data represents already and what it's missing, and then also thinking creatively about how we can leverage qualitative data, number one, in order to have a multi-methodological orientation to accountability and measuring outcomes. The second thing I would say is create a approach, a strategy built on stakeholder voices. See what is important to the people you're trying to represent. Make them part of that data strategy process. And so this is where it becomes a community building exercise and an exercise in DEI and J. So the process of creating metrics and a measurement strategy is part of the DEI and J process. So you're not just measuring the outcomes of the efforts, it becomes part of the efforts. It becomes an essential element of the efforts. There's a really nice book called Measure What Matters by John Doerr, where at least in organizations, he talks about empowering people to create their own metrics of success. And we can extend that to how do we represent communities and voices in our data measurement strategy. And it's a longer, I'm happy to have this conversation if folks want to touch base with me at any time, and we can schedule a Zoom time to chat about it. But there's approaches that we can use to use that the need for those metrics, whether qualitative or quantitative, to construct indicators of success. And so we know that these metrics that we're collecting are indicators of what we want to know, and also the people who we're trying to touch, we're trying to represent, are represented in that data strategy.
Thank you so much. I am taking notes. Yes, also, hey, dear friends in the audience, like Jada said, please write your questions in the Q&A toolbar. I also know when you have a keynote, there's a lot of information going on, and that takes some time to like digest. But if there's something on your mind, please write it down in your Q&A chat.
And maybe while our participants are just thinking and contemplating the information they received, I can proceed with another question, which is, I believe, relevant to some developments going on in Finland. The program that you started has been introduced with these lines. The Diversity, Equity and Inclusion major is designed to create professional pathways for students who are interested in career in diversity, equity and inclusion. And we know that in the business, there are so many positions coming with diversity and inclusion responsibilities, and especially in the different organizations, the HR departments have evolved into a different function. Now we are talking about sense of belonging, we are talking about talent retention, and there is a kind of change going on, actually, the way how we work with people in an organization. But also in the introduction, you say that this major will help students become those key agents for strategic innovation and organization health rooted in DEI. So my question to you, what can the arts and cultural sector learn from this approach? If we look at the health of an organization which is rooted in DEI, who should be the key agents, and who is the one who needs to take responsibility to transform arts and cultural organizations to become more relevant and healthy?
Yeah, it's such a fascinating question. That's another one that we could have a much longer conversation on. You'll hear two approaches often. You'll hear top down and bottom up, right? So we need a strong leader to kind of have a vision of change that then permeates down throughout an organization. Or you need bottom up, you need people to demand change that leads to movement of change to the top. By the way, we just saw this in Disney with the Don't Say Gay law that was passed in Florida, where the CEO of Disney came out with a rather tepid, to be generous, response to the Don't Say Gay. You know, you can't talk about sexual orientation or gender identity in schools, especially kindergarten through third grade. And after he said that, the group, the employees of Disney wrote a letter back and said, no, that's not good enough. You need to do better. And he did. He came back with a stronger statement. And so that's a good example of bottom up. But I also think we need to think about middle out. But what I mean by middle out is often it's people in the middle part of an organization, middle management, that often get stuck. They often get stuck with initiatives that are given from the top down with little direction, resources, or help to implement. And often these initiatives are put on top of what they're already responsible for doing. So if you're looking at DEI and J metrics, for instance, are these metrics for the middle managers put on top of things they're already responsible for? Or is it in place of things that they are already responsible for? So I think that it depends. I think that we need to create, DEI and J is not just an organizational initiative that comes from the top. It's everyone's initiative. And there's ways from micro affirmations in daily interactions that we can all be a part of to create an environment and culture. Even if there's no leadership, no vision of leadership around this, it doesn't mean that employees can't take the initiatives themselves. And I will also say I've been doing some work on creating social movements and organizations where that even if you look at something like Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States, he didn't start the civil rights movement. It was already going. It was already happening. And he played a very central and important role around strategy. And if you've seen the movie Selma, it delves into that strategy in great detail, but it was already happening. And so I think society is moving and changing. That's a fact. It always does. There are those forces which try to limit its rate of change and to push it backwards. That always happens. And so it becomes incumbent upon those who envision a different and better future to find ways, great and small, to initiate identity and belief into action in ways that are everyday and mundane and are strategic and organizational changing. And so I think the key agents of change are all of us to begin with. And I think organizationally, speaking for leadership, we need to think about what resources can we give people to make these efforts successful, and not just do it because we feel we have to, or that it's a regulatory requirement, but it's a strategic opportunity that we need to embrace, move forward on, and ultimately will lead for not just the success of the organization, but creating an inclusive culture in which everyone feels represented and will ultimately result in greater attraction of talent and retention of it as well.
Okay, thank you. And we all have power and responsibility to take an action. I think your answer perfectly links to the comment in the chat. I don't know, have you seen it? But I would
Yes.
like to read it loud
Please.
for everyone. Anneli Kanninen, your thoughts on how to approach an institution or educational organization as an individual working or studying in the said institution or organization in creating more DEI, how to start and forward the conversation and DEI work and still maintaining one's individual balance and safety. This is question.
Right.
Often it seems that the decision makers and gatekeepers are not ready to listen and facilitate DEI.
Thank you for that question. And given that you are talking about maintaining one's individual balance and safety, I can't presume to give you an answer without knowing more details about that. And it's fine that you don't need to say, but those are very real concerns. And we're seeing this right now, especially in the United States, with the great, move backwards, the great regression in many states in the United States. And in terms of not being ready to listen and facilitate DEI and J, again, one of the questions I would wonder is, how do they envision it? What do they think it means? What is their schema, their mental map of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice? I can walk into a classroom where everyone, quote unquote, looks the same and find a lot of diversity in that classroom. Just because everyone looks the same phenotypically in terms of their appearance doesn't mean they're all the same. We live in diversity every day, whether we know it or not. Now, in some ways, oftentimes there are social, historical factors which create greater segregation among groups in clearly identifiable ways. Black people live in one place, white people live in another place. Rich people live in one location, poor people live in another location. And we need to address those things. But one of the things I thought we need to start with is the fact that we live in a diverse world, period. There's no escaping it. It's already here. And so resistance to DEI and J is resistance to reality in many respects. The question then becomes, how do we extend it in ways that push against societal norms, systemic inequalities, organizational policies, to expand what that means in real terms? And so that's one of the places I would start with, is just identifying the ways in which we're already here. We're already in this world of diversity. Now, how do we get to equity, inclusion, and justice? And that's often where the pushback can start. And so, Annalie, without knowing any more details, but please feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat. Happy to talk with you about it if I can give any more specific ideas based upon understanding more of the details. But I think we start the conversation by accepting the reality that it's already here. And that businesses, the reason why we created this major was not because we were just ideologically predisposed to wanting to. We were responding to organizational need. Companies said we need people. It's one of the fastest growing areas of work in the United States, at least, are DEI professionals. We are merely responding to market forces. So leaders who are not accepting this are leaders who are not leading their organizations well. And you're either an early adopter or you're going to be a late adopter, or your organization is going to fail to attract top level talent, because Gen Z workers, and I'm around students all the time, are looking for these elements when they're evaluating offers and which organizations they want to belong to.
Well, thank you. And Sonia, do we have time? Because I see one question or comment also in the Q&A session.
I think we can, yeah, we have time for like one short question. Yeah.
Okay. In the Q&A session, Gary, I'm just reading for everyone. One of the participants says, I would be interested in hearing how to respond to leadership not wanting to engage in change towards more DEIJ, you included justice, because they feel it would require more training, workshops, and hence postponing the problem and refusing to take action.
Okay, so I'm trying to parse out that time frame quickly, because I know we're short on time. If organizations aren't about professional development, they're not good organizations. I teach a course on employee experience at our MBA program at Bentley. And if organizations need to be committed to enriching the lives of workers beyond just the workplace. And so organizations need to provide those opportunities, because it's going to pay dividends long-term. Rather than short-term thinking, we need to have long-term strategy. And DEI and J is part of that long-term strategy. And Jada, can you say the second part of that again, that question again?
I have to go back. Because they feel it would require, they are referring to the leadership, more training, workshops.
Right.
They postpone the problem and refuse to take action.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it's hard. I mean, I can't speak for what organization you may or may not be referring to. It's hard to cure bad leadership, quite frankly. There's no easy path forward to doing that. But we have seen in situations like with Disney that efforts by employees to require or demand change in their leadership results in change. It can result in change. So in thinking about how to create a social movement in your organization, I've been doing some work on how we think about applying social movement theory to organizational change. How might we create a social movement in our organization to demand, require, request, propose, whatever words, however strong or gentle what word choice you want to use, that leaders need to be more responsive. They need to, it's part of our organizational requirement, because guess what? Every business case that I know of has shown that doing so leads to better outcomes. Okay. So if you're a leader who won't do it, are you telling me as a leader that you're not committed to leading this organization to have better outcomes? If you're not willing to make changes to have better outcomes, then the organization needs to think carefully about the quality of leadership that person is providing. And this is where the business cases, whether it's Harvard Business Review or Forbes magazine or Fast Company, or any of this research being done, has demonstrated, Ernst & Young that I referenced has demonstrated the positive impact of these efforts. And so leaders, if they're about leadership of the company and not just servicing their ideology, they need to embrace these efforts. And if they don't know how, that's fair. This is where people from our program might be helpful in assisting them in doing so, or consultants might be helpful in assisting them in doing so. It's okay to ask for help. And leaders, if they don't know what this means and how to do it, just ask for help. And there are many who are willing to help and help the organization move forward in a more positive direction.
I think this is excellent, and I believe that Stop Hatchet Now platform exists exactly the same reason for those who in the need of help. And I would like to take on the wonderful sentence that you said: resisting DEI and justice, actually refusing the reality. I think this should be a kind of motto for many leaders, and that was wonderful. Thank you very much, so much, Gary, and we will not let you go today. And I look forward to seeing you at Roundtable 1 at 2:15 with Helsinki time. And thank you so much for the platform for giving us this space, and all the participants and commenters. And floor is yours, Sonia. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gary and Jada. So friends, now we'll take a tiny 10-minute break. Maybe you can move your body a little bit, take some water, like let all the information sink in, and then we'll move on into the last panel discussion of today, which will take place in Finnish. And now we will actually go into these topics of metrics and statistics and how to make it visible what is going on already in the institutions. So thank you, Gary. Thank you, Jada. Thank you, everybody. Let's take a tiny 10-minute break and we'll come back for past 1 Finnish time. See you soon.